want to thank you guys again for your support. The myths of Tartary. It flew on wings without feathers, sat in a tree without leaves. A person came without hands, set it in motion without feet, roasted it without fire, consumed it without a mouth. Dinosaurs mean terrible lizards. And all of a sudden this starts to trigger me when I hear something like that. Because let's just say there's a very deep ingrained part of me that looks at these animals as powerful beings. And power can be feared and it can be respected, but it doesn't need to be hated. In fact, in proper circumstances, it can even be admired. But this is not the legacy that they had about lizards. And it took a while to re-examine the narrative. In fact, it took a place. It was really down under that turned things upside down, and if it wasn't for Australia and New Zealand, where we started to realize more about these sky mammals and these land birds, and what the ducks, like platypi, our classifications started to change, and we started to look at things a little bit differently. And we realized there's just so much variance within a kind, such as the kiwis, these furry birds from New Zealand, that helped reveal the relationship between reptiles and birds, or maybe just help prove it definitively to anyone who hadn't already figured out the riddle. But it was a pretty common theory which eventually led to the 1960s feathered dinosaur hypothesis that conceptualized the de-evolution of these starve-crazed reptiles into insane birds, stripped of their teeth and protruding a razor-sharp jaw, along with a theory of mutation that described the development of the plumaceous and the pinnaceous feather as the product of generational survival after some major disaster. However, recent evidence shows that there might have been less evolution and that maybe dinosaurs and birds are closer related after all. Exclusive breeds of fowlage, many lost, including the giant eagle and the 14-foot-tall running moa, and Chinese discoveries of various sorts of pterosauri, or feathered monsters, not necessarily, but including dinosaurs, some with the capacity for flight, giant monsters covered with feathers. And the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History has a fascinating exhibit on China's feathered dinosaurs, including the pterodactyl, but many more you probably never heard about. And the Chinese Academy of Sciences evidence about the breeding habits of the Sinosauropteryx and the Protarchaeopteryx, and our cute little friend, the little Confucianornis, provide reasonable evidence for the existence of a lost kind that dominated across land and air and sea. And whether or not it took many millions of years is something to be contested, but the concept of a mutation, or more specifically an altered sequence, being responsible for the difference between having and not having these feathers, has been identified as a closed CD4 binding loop on the promoter sequences between HV1W1 and SIVA1 by geneticist and DNA coder Craig Venter, sort of a mythical legend himself actually, famous for competing directly with the Human Genome Project and also holding the honor of being the first to produce artificial life by jump-starting a cell using sources of both natural and his own fabricated artificial DNA. He's been accused of playing God. I thought I should mention that. But his work has helped to prove it very likely that many of the dinosaurs did in fact have feathers. And though this has actually already been deduced often from fossils and from the anatomy of these dinosaurs, again, due to 19th century interpretations, these ideas were not considered plausible, and so these concepts were disregarded, at least until today. And in fact, now we know the Tyrannosaurus, or the Pterosaurus rex, itself in fact had feathers, and was not in fact the king of the predators. Actually, he was a scavenger, much like his relative, apparently the vulture. And though he is often depicted erect and imposing, due to the structural anatomy of the Pterosaurus rex, of the Tartarosaurus rex, the Tartarosaurus could not actually stand upright and could only lean down, scavenging for food along the ground. And while it's possible that somehow we've missed that he had giant wings, there are many birds which are not flying birds. However, they are often very fast, often incredible runners, only much faster than the emu or the ostrich. And across the world there are terrifying stories of being pursued from New Zealand to Peru and the Americas, these giant fast-running birds. And perhaps account is a better word, because clearly they existed recently, until they too went the way of the dodo bird. But not all of them went into extinction, or at least there are rumors of their continued existence, such as the pterostorm, which gives the giant condor a run for its money. But these stories of giant birds permeate our culture, stories of being hunted by them, and of us hunting them. But also beautiful stories like the condor, a beautiful, magnificent bird that was hunted nearly to extinction, only luckily just barely managed to survive. And I'm grateful to say I've seen the condors, more of them in Patagonia than in California. But when you see them in California, it's just a little bit sadder, but also just a little bit rarer. So you take that with it too. But they are interesting, if not beautiful birds. Very scary faces. And perhaps they reveal something about these giant dinosaurs that we haven't yet considered, what they actually look like. And that brings me to the Chickenosaurus. In looking to find the closest relative to the dinosaur, and don't ask why yet, just assume it's because scientists are benignly curious. If we were to find the DNA sequences that differentiated the dinosaur from the chicken, as geneticist Jack Horner has done with the help of Craig Venter, and in the production of an embryo with altered DNA to more closely resemble the promoter sequences from dinosaurs, so that scientists could bring dinosaurs to life, or at least something like them, using the DNA information that we have from the bird genome. And maybe this makes a sort of sense why these old school long-haired weirdos were so interested in different kinds of birds, mythical or otherwise. In fact, Benjamin Franklin fought ardently to make the national bird of the United States the turkey, in opposition to the bald eagle hawk. And maybe he was onto something. And while people spend so much time arguing about the lizard people, perhaps they should start considering the bird people. You see, bird people actually go way back. It's all about bird people. Albeit with serpentine energy, bird people. And all this stuff is really old news, whether or not you take it seriously. And chances are it's been sitting there all your lives in the library, hidden amongst the dewy-coated shelves of pulp fiction, revised history, and pop science articles. But a seemingly underscored point is the contemporary existence of seemingly mythical creatures such as the carnivorous plants that are found all over the world, such as the giant Malaysian Rafflesia, which has been found to reach recorded sizes of over 8 feet in diameter, and eats rodents, marsupials, and primates, including small humans. The Rafflesia is just one of many discovered carnivorous plants, and there are hundreds more, at least. In fact, dozens that I've seen myself in the Amazon, in South America, where at least 115 different carnivorous plants have been identified so far, and counting. And this concept of walking plants is clearly not hypothetical either, as we know of the contemporary existence of walking trees, such as the ones I've seen in Ecuador, and I wish you get to see them too before they become the victim of extinction due to deforestation. And the identification between the relationship of these giant monsters and their feathers, and the potential for the reemergence of dimorphism genetic mutation, has been alluded to in science fiction for centuries, along with the historic precedents for the plausibility of a found and targeted dinosaur nesting ground. The nests of these giant worldwide creatures, a sort of Jurassic Park. And some of this had been alluded to in pop culture, such as a band that appeared in the TV show Buffy, a band called Rasputina, which decades ago produced music about the concept of the comet of 1812, stylizing themselves as Tater rock, full of string instruments, very steampunk, with songs about subjects such as the buried lost fossils of the Nephilim, entitled The Holocaust of Giants, and songs about the slowing of the planet, and a song about the great conspiracy of, just to name a few. And Melora Krieger from Rasputina said that she wrote the songs that she featured over the previous 2 years when she realized that the current world events were more bizarre than anything she could scrounge up from the distant past. And so she began looking deeper. And maybe that's how you do it. You just have to find a bunch of far-flung things and tie them together properly. This is a lot of people's theory, really. I mean, how else do you get the crazy idea to bring back dinosaurs or to make a Chickenosaurus if you can't? Like, what kind of people are trying so hard to create monsters that they're totally willing to settle on something actually arguably far more disturbing? Then again, I do come from a generation that advertised and incentivized the reemergence of these dinosaur monsters as fast friends and Paleolithic pals you'd wish to have, at least in their traditional forms. But as we're getting closer to realizing something more real, something so much more disturbing than the thing that we were thinking of, Perhaps even more terrifying because it's more plausible, and closer because, after all, as we now know, these terrifying creatures were not just part of our dreams, but part of our lives. And as much has been revealed over the centuries about the relationship between the birds and dinosaurs, including the tibia bones and the Deinonychus and the chicken, it was really all to your friend DNA who made it possible to isolate the variances in the UCP1 genome sequences between the various Opisthokonta in order to isolate these sequences for ginormous feathered monsters. You see, scientists are laughing in our face, saying, we can totally create monsters. And society is like, stop? Although really society is like, but go on. Because people want to see terrible monsters. I know I did. And when I was in Argentina, I checked out the Argentinosaurus. And the Argentinosaurus is pretty magnificent. It's over 33 meters from tail to neck. And he might have been a vegetarian, but he still was no one to mess with. And they're doing a pretty good job of digging up a lot of these things. And I think we talked a little bit about the concept of the Opisthokonta continents, made of giant primordial carnivorous fungi. But there's an entirely other kind of prehistoric giant being that was made of fungus, which covered the planet in a mycelial network, much like the internet today, or much like the brains or the stomach or the lungs all scrambled together, sending food and information and water and air all to different parts of the network, developing the chemical processes which nature used, even to this day, in order to fabricate and break down rocks into soil, making life possible for these great giant monsters, but also for their deaths. And as we know, these fungi can consume rock, but also metal and ore, so they are made of these materials. But this is just one more type of perhaps lost monster. There are just so many more that are so very recently lost. And another interesting thing about the Argentinosaurus was its semi-aquatic lifestyle, with the discovery of evidence of lake nests. And perhaps this reminds you of another beast that has lake nests of its own. A creature not too dissimilar from the Argentinosaurus, of course, is the Lochness monster of Scotland, which, aside from this alleged story about Saint Columba Hibernia fighting against the Loch Ness monster, and actually using a Loch Ness monster as a boat, the Loch Ness monster really wasn't noticed much until 1933, when everyone started to make a big deal about it. And it could be said that this is just a coincidence, but I'm glad to say I'm not the first person to think about it, is that the self-renowned Antichrist and professed ardent Satanist Aleister Crowley had purchased the Boleskine house around Loch Ness and performed without finishing a ritual which led to speculation that Aleister Crowley might have unwittingly or on purpose summoned the Loch Ness monster himself. But that's just a crazy theory. The truth is, there's plenty of examples of contemporary giants that have existed all throughout the lifespan of the human species. Though many of these great giants are extinct, many of them do live on. And while many were poached and hunted, perhaps there are a few more that are not just endangered, they are exotic, yet altogether very real, and you are discouraged from searching for them, for obvious reasons. But even in terms of giant Leviathan Opisthokonta, there's a giant mushroom that's over 7 miles wide in diameter in Oregon, and this is just one example of many. Though this is only 1 cell wall thick, it covers the expanse of an entire Great Plain, and it can be seen from space. It's strange but true, the largest organism on Earth is a fungus, and there's evidence to show and reason to believe that our entire world is covered in a giant 1 cell wall thick mycelial fungi throughout the sky, above the land, air, and sea. However, it has learned to be stealthy and to go unnoticed. But one thing I bring up about the Loch Ness monster, and the reason I think it's interesting that there's a story about him that predates Aleister Crowley, is that beyond the fact that that story involves a saint named Saint Columba, Saint Columba is remembered for conquering the Picts, the small native people that lived in the Frieslands before being conquered by the Celts and the Saxons, who lived in living houses of woven together forest branches, at least according to myth, had great tools and dyed their skin blue, or at least they were blue after all, a tradition that lives on in Scotland to this day. Though perhaps it's a transmuted ritual, and perhaps these houses were alive for a reason. And considering the stories of Merlin, who helped the bastard son of a conquering King Uther unite the lands and become the lord of a new kingdom called Camelot, in a place we know today for the bagpipes brought there by the Carthaginians from Africa and their Trojan kilts. Perhaps there is more to be said about this sword in the stone or anvil story, and these blue people, the Picts, and this land, the Old Country. So I hope by now you've figured out this riddle that we were talking about at the beginning, or at least now we're going to talk about it again, so we're going to bring it up. It's the old featherless bird riddle, and I'm going to say it now from the German translation instead of the Latin. Flew a bird featherless, sat on a tree leafless, came a maiden speechless, and ate the bird featherless from off the tree leafless. So, if you haven't figured out what about this featherless bird, it's a dragon. And so some of the symbolism that you might think of, who's like a bird without feathers, and these giant branchless tree stubs, which are basically, and these giant branchless stone tree trunks made of various minerals, such as the mesas. All across the world we find these giant, seemingly cut stone slabs. However, science didactically dictates to us that they cannot and must not be a natural occurrence, other than that flooding and wind has caused their erosion. But then again, according to the Mandelbrot algorithm, we can deduce by looking at redwoods from the diameter of these stubs, based on the correlation with the height and the branch width of the redwoods, how far apart these mesas would be from each other. And if you start looking into petrified forests and these mesas around the planet, you will be surprised what you find. Unless, of course, you already have familiarity with the fairy tales of Tartary, where dragons and griffins have been the symbols for the ages, or any culture, often adorned on every shield all over the world, and in front of churches and cathedrals. These fantastical creatures are very diverse, not even past tense. You will not find a culture amongst our world that does not have them. And yet, somehow, a grand percentage of the population have relegated these creatures from fact to myth, similarly to the carnivorous plants. There are still great lizards to this day. And I remember holding a two-headed snake in kindergarten, and though the meaning was not clear, the significance certainly was of a biblical metaphor. But aside from relegating these very fantastical and very real creatures to myth in storytelling and symbology, they also relegated these creatures into perhaps extinction, as they considered them enemies. And this is very interesting about the spy versus spy horizontal archetype, because it reveals that they considered these dragons as kings as well as conquerors like themselves. And it was only a matter of manifest destiny about whom would claim the serpentine energy, or dragon energy as it's called today. And there's a very interesting cartoon I saw as a child called The Flight of Dragons, and it's in the style of animation of The Last Unicorn, and it has some pretty big voices, including James Earl Jones, the voice of Darth Vader, who plays the evil king and the evil dragon. But the story is all about the science of magic, and the appearance and disappearance of the divine and the interaction between the two realms of the real and the unreal, or the magic and the scientific. But it brings a young scientist who's been creating a world into the world of the dragons, and he learns all about the science behind the flight of dragons and what they must consume in order to produce the gases which makes it possible for them to produce fire and to rise. But because of the distance between these realms of these dragons, there are different realms for the different territories, and different dragons that match the different environments that they live in. And all across the Americas and Asia and the Slavic and Bohemian lands, the modern Tartary, and the rest of the modern states which encompass the lost land of Tartary, stories of the conquest of dragons can be found all over, and they become particularly popular in the West in the 16th century, in the period often considered the Dark Ages. This is interesting because this is also the period we consider the mini ice age or the cold ages because of the natural disasters which devastated many nations and wiped out many species, much as science tells. But there are so many more pictures of these conquests of these dinosaurs. And not that natural disasters don't happen, but the poaching narrative is one that I can understand. At least there sure is example for it, so it seems like it follows the exact same trend. But a lot of these elites go out searching for these grand creatures in order to poach them or even just to catch them. And because of the recent occurrence of new money, many poaching laws have been put into order in order to cease the collection of these artifacts for the new upper class, such as is the case in China where mammoth tusks are all the rage. But it is not for the love of these animals, or perhaps it is for the love of poaching them, that these beasts are kept hidden from you. such as the mokele-mbembe of the Congo, which is a very real and very ferocious but very little dinosaur. And I hope I'm not blowing the scene up too much by saying, yeah, it still exists, but stay out of the Congo. For a lot of reasons besides the mokele-mbembe. Curiosity is the thing that kills the cat, or the mokele-mbembe, of which you'll find archaeological evidence in cave drawings particularly, in the Americas, China, and Europe, that feature the same creature, simultaneous to pictures of bipedal humanoids, often exhibited in not just hunting, but in some sort of domestication as if converted into a farm animal or some sort of pet. These prehistoric pictures of humanoids riding on dinosaurs are not only existent, they're actually quite plausible, because we know now that these giant dinosaurs existed simultaneously to the mastodons, as well as simultaneously to humans. And if that seems jarring to you, it's important to remember that up until recently, it was greatly argued that the mastodons did not exist simultaneously to the humanoids. And of course we now know conclusively that they did, but I ask you, considering there are so many pictures of mastodons being drawn by these supposedly non-archaeological minded people, then I have to ask the same question about why are there so many drawings from Native Americans and worldwide troglodytes about the simultaneous existence of these dinosaurs, let alone of their domestication by these prehistoric peoples. It might be a syllogism, but it seems like a fair one to make. Of course, in some circumstances, domestication might have not seemed like an option, such as with the Aborigines and the MEGALANIA, a fierce, giant, predatorial, venomous iguana, sort of like the giant Komodo dragon cousin of the saltwater crocodile, which is a living example to this day and might itself seem like evidence of some sort of paradox in the chronology of the multi-million-year apocalypse story, especially considering the home of these animals are the exact places where these supposed asteroids were supposedly to have hit. However, today's crocodiles are quite a bit smaller, even in their grandest sizes, compared to the beasts that existed not too long ago, and the Varanus prisca, or the Megalania, would need to eat a fair-sized primate rather regularly, and the stories of the Aborigine hunting the Megalania are numerous, and apparently still occur in dream time. However, it took centuries for people to admit that these were true, actual beings and creatures that they had hunted, and been hunted by. Not just inflated myths about Komodo dragons, but bigger, albeit something similar in all the worst ways. A giant, fierce reptile, with extremely powerful venom, which both corrodes away at the muscles and paralyzes the victim, making it impossible to move, let alone escape. A terrifying, utterly helpless and painful, yet convenient meal of prey. But these beasts of burden were too much for the Aborigine to domesticate, so they had to be conquested and destroyed. And the Aborigines realized that creatures seemed to be paralyzed in the dark cold of the early morning, as their cold blood waited for the sun to heat them up. And upon this deduction, the Aborigines set up a hypothesis for a strategy of attack. And in the early dawn morning, they burned the outback, thousands of miles of old-growth forest and many types of flora and fauna, different animals completely lost. It will be a many year until we discover all of what was burned away, if we ever do. But it is quite plausible that we will not, and that an entire ecosystem, if not civilization, was swept away in this moment. So it's a very interesting commonality between the myth of the Aborigines and the myths of the Occident. But as we know, myths do not mean things that did not happen, only truths that have been hidden or misunderstood. We now know that these monsters, these dinosaurs, these dragons did exist, and that they were killed off in a major extermination campaign. However, as most of the evidence from these occurrences would have been dissected for spoils, most of the examples we have of these lost creatures come from sudden deaths, often in great numbers, as if an entire colony was wiped out by a sudden wave of mud. And there are, of course, many examples over the centuries of metaphor about these slayings of dragons, as if they are aliens or as if they are other greater rulers. But it's starting to seem like it's a bit more than metaphor. In fact, I would say it's beyond that completely. There certainly will be examples of metaphor to be found, but the example of actual dragons and dinosaurs, within the time of our own human history, has reached the point where even the mainstream will acknowledge it. And while perhaps the myth of St. George fighting the dragon may have more to do with the mark of Cain and actually humans of various kinds, The evidence for these great dinosauric dragons has become irrefutable, and some might say it's about time. I want to thank you guys again for your support.